Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the RPE podcast. Today, we are back with another research review. Last time, we looked at some cueing literature and coaching literature, which provided some solid discussion. I'm your host, Connor, and today I'm joined, as usual, by Steve. How you doing, mate?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, thank you, mate. And joining us again on another research review, we've got Nathaniel Mills. How are you, mate?
Good, thanks, lads. Good to be here again.
Good. How did you feel after your first exposure on the RPE podcast?
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was good. What do you think, Steve? Passable?
I think he passed. I think he did well.
Get him back on, keep him in.
Yeah, keep him around for a while. He's a good kid.
Yeah, good. How's everyone been?
I am legitimately cooked right now. My brain is just like that little few seconds silence, but just then, like I've just finished a big day of patience back to back. Got so many notes to write and so many different bits and pieces. So I am definitely in I don't know, brain dead mode right now. Let's see what happens.
Practice the monkeys.
You're the Homer Simpson symbols monkey in the brain.
Yeah.
What about you, Nat? Did you get out on the golf course today?
I did this afternoon, yeah. Pretty similar to Steve, actually. Feeling pretty cooked. I've had a very busy couple of weeks.
On the golf course.
Not today, but the last couple of weeks I've been very busy. I've had a bucket load of new referrals that I've had to follow up. And one of the downsides to being self-employed is you got to do a lot of the paperwork yourself, like service agreements and quotes, following up with support coordinators, a little bit of extra stuff that normally you wouldn't have to do.
So. All right. So all a little bit.
You, Connor?
Yeah, no, I was just about to say I'm still recovering from a music festival I went to on the weekend, just catching up on the sleep because I didn't get much. But I feel like we're still in a good enough brain space to deliver this podcast, and hopefully people follow along with us and we're not just incoherent messes today.
Nice.
Yeah, right. So I was just thinking, should we do an episode count?
Nah, there's been hundreds of them, surely.
Do we reveal to everyone how many episodes we've actually done? How many actually made
Feels like it. What is it, 19 or something?
I reckon 20.
No, I think if we discount the extra sodes and the smaller bits, whatever, I think this is the main episode of 14. It's the second research review, but it's the 14th big content episode. So
no,
it sounds about
well
right.
Done us.
Look at us go, yeah.
Because I was listening to and going through some of the older podcasts, and I think 12 does sound about correct.
Yeah.
Plus the two research reviews.
I can't believe we've made it that far.
Yeah, 14 podcasts. Who would have thought? But we're doing well. I reckon we keep going. Let's do an episode count. Let's have a goal with this. We'll talk about this after. But
good.
Good. I've got another curly question. This would be great. What have you boys learnt this week?
You got first.
Oh no, I got the monkeys and the symbols.
The monkeys. Oh, I was hoping that. What have I learnt this week?
Could be anything. Skill, task, joke.
Just like last time you asked me what was the heaviest thing that I lifted, and I was like, oh God, I don't even lift. Apparently I don't even learn. Yeah, lower your expectations. What have I learned? I've been working with a new MS client this week. Young, and I think having my expectations at a realistic level is something I'm still adjusting to. I sort of just assumed because this particular person was really young. I know they have a neurodegenerative condition, but really didn't take much to make them really tired and cooked. And in my head, I'm like, oh, they're young, they're going to have good capacity. And in my head, we didn't do much and very tired. So still learning that nearly every single person in front of you is different, no matter how old or young they are, whether they have a similar diagnosis to another one of your clients. It really just depends.
I don't think MS and Rocky are probably a very good mix either.
Oh, mate, yeah, have no idea how many we have up here. It's absolutely insane. I reckon it would take up close to 30% of my caseload. And I just feel for the guys, particularly the last 2 weeks. It's been upwards of nearly 40 degrees. And some of them don't run aircon.
Jeez.
It's just,
Ice
yeah,
vests?
it's rough.
Need an ice vest, mate.
Just awful. Absolutely awful.
That's intense.
That's what
What's
I
that?
learned this week, Steve.
Yeah, mine's been a lot of this ISO stuff because it's like my next blog that I'm writing for Physio Network. So I have reviewed over the last week. There's 36 papers in the that I'm like citing in the blog, and I've read about 15 of them again this week. So that might also be why my head is fried a little. And the other thing was a little cool podcast that's in your wheelhouse, Parky. It was about like a performance analysis in tennis, and I didn't realize, like, you just watch, and I didn't realize how much of the game is actually already structured. Like I think of it as a reactive game, something like, because when I play it's reactive, but no, it's like that every single thing, like
It's
they're just like,
probabilistic.
I'm putting this ball hit. Like they actually have in every set where the ball like should go probabilistically, and they have that's actually like done on for like almost, they have data point spreadsheets that are like, hey, you should play this game if it goes here, like, if
And it
he's
depends on
pushed
the
you
matchup.
wide, you should push up the court, not cross,
Yep.
or you should push cross court, etc.
Yep.
It's unbelievable. I didn't realize that it's all like almost pre-programmed, and they're just playing out mostly a pre-programmed game the
You
best that
can
they can.
you can set
And
up some
the cool
points.
stuff happens as it gets longer and longer. He said as a rally gets longer and longer, then that's where randomness starts to come in. So
Yep.
it's like it was over like 15 or 20, I can't remember exactly, but over 15 or 20 shots, then the probabilities get lower. But if the rally lasts less than that, it's almost like the statisticians could have predetermined where the ball, like from the first shot and from the return, then what the
It's
rest
literally
of
like a
the
game of chess
rally was going
Yep.
to look like.
Yep.
at the
It's
start. The
awesome.
start of a game of chess. Like the
Yeah,
first few
I
moves are
couldn't
like
believe that. I was
preordained.
like, that is
Yeah.
unbelievable. Yeah. So I don't know if it takes away or adds to the pleasure of watching it, because I always think of it being like this. They've made an amazing reactive decision where it was just
It's
pre-planned by someone sitting in front of a computer who then
it's
told their coach to help them to,
it, it's still to have the
yeah.
ability to do it. And then you see with like the top 100, like they have the ability to read it immediately, and they have the ability to put it in a place that's maybe slightly difficult for the next person to have an easy shot. Like even though you're returning, like you can change the outcome of the point based on hitting one good shot. So like if this then type scenarios happen all the time. Like if I get a short ball, I'm coming in down the line, I'm going to cover my line. He's probably going to try to rip it cross court over the low part of the net. So I should be expecting a cross court volley. Then it's then on the other person to go for, yep, do I go low percentage down the line? Do I go high percentages across court? Or do I lob? Like you've still got to react to the decision, but the most common one's going to be, it's coming back.
That's the one that you're covering most. Yeah.
You're covering the line one. That's
Yeah.
So
and that's where you see like people stand on like serves and everything at important points. There's like, stand there. If he fucking does the other one, well,
too good.
It's bad luck. Like they just outwitted us.
Yep. Or they were just literally, I couldn't do anything about that. The execution of that was just far too good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. That's what
cool.
I learned this week. That I'm not watching just cool reacting happenings.
Nice.
So that actually happens in squash to an extent as well. I would say that
Happen in most sports, I reckon.
Yeah. It's probably 10 to 20 years behind as far as technology and sort of tracking those sort of stats. But an example of where this applies, do you know Paul Cole, Steve? Do you know Paul Cole? So he's a New Zealand squash player that kind of went from nowhere to like top 10 in the space of 3 years, basically by just smashing himself with CrossFitters essentially and just training really hard. He was world number 1 last year, and he got to world number 1 by employing a different strategy to anyone else against the current world number 1, Ali Farag. So generally in squash, the pattern of play tends to be backhand wall, like 75% of the time. But looking at the statistics, Paul had actually found that Ali was quite weak on his forehand. So he just played down the wall on the forehand and he beat him 3-love to like 6 points every game. And Ali is like one of the best players in the world. So it's every sport, these sort of stats do come into play. And then I think in tennis, it depends on how good the player is, whether they're left-handed or right-handed. Are they a good backhand player? Are they a good forehand player? Do they play a single-handed backhand? Do they play a double-handed backhand?
Yep. It's still highly variable, yeah. Well, due to concisity, I'm not going to tell you what I learned this week.
We learned too much. There's too much learning.
We learned way too much. Yeah. So I reckon let's get into it.
An article.
We do have an article.
What did we learn? What did we learn about cricket this week?
Oh no, man! Let's not even talk about that. We have an article. We're getting into this. So we have an article from BMC Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation Journal, released in 2017. It's open access, so if you want to follow along, try to, like with the paper. I had to read it a couple of times. It's pretty heavy, and some of the figures don't make a lot of sense to me on the first read, but we got there. The article is called, "Are there two forms of isometric muscle action? Results of the experimental study support a distinction between holding and pushing isometric function." So essentially the background for this paper is, in isometric muscle function, there are subjectively two modes of performance. One can either hold isometrically, thus resisting impacting force, or push isometrically, therefore working against a stable resistance. The purpose of this study was to investigate whether this can be distinguished objectively. So we feel this when we do the stuff, and as coaches, you might notice that people report these things back to you, but does science actually back this up? So what they did was they got 10 people, 5 men, 5 women, to perform 2 different measuring modes of 80% of their max voluntary contraction, which was measured with a special pneumatic system, which we'll get into later. They got them to do 12 pushes, they measured their max, and then they got them to do a combination of either 3 pushing type isometrics or holding type isometrics. And they measured the signals of pressure, force, acceleration, the mechanomyography and tendography of the elbow extensor mechanism. So it was done at the elbow, and recorded the duration that they could hold the isometric for, as well as their peak force, EMG, all that kind of stuff. So essentially they got the people to sit in a chair and they hooked them up like this in 90 degrees, and then the pressure thing either pushed against them or they had to push into it. The people who it was pushing against, they just had to match it, so they had to figure it out as they went. And then the people who were pushing against it, they watched a little gauge on the screen in front of them that told them how hard they were pushing, and they just had to maintain the same amount of push for kind of as long as they can. So what did they find? They found significant differences between the holding and the pushing isometric. Especially apparent that the force endurance during the holding were way shorter. So the people, it was pretty much half the time that the pushing could do. That's what they found with that. They didn't really find any differences in the activation or the activity that happens in the muscle or it happens at the tendon. And they didn't find any significant difference in the frequency ranges that they measured for like EMG and things like that. If they looked at the last 10% of the duration, the people who were pushing could still push harder for the last 10% of the duration of however long they pushed for. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, what were our first thoughts about this paper?
For me, straight up, like, sample size and what, as you said, off there, proof concept type of paper. So, for me, they're kind of trying to take something that in the S&C world has been done for a long time and kind of handed down from generation to generation of being like we learnt them as yielding isometrics, which is the hold type, and overcoming isometrics, which was the push type. And you've always used them slightly differently, and you always know that kind of, although interestingly, don't really use them the way that they've set up in this test. But as you said, they're trying to just find a proof of concept to see whether or not like these two things actually exist as separate entities, or if it's the one thing. So yeah, with that small of a population, I think the only thing that we can really take from it for a first go is that, well, for me, that the difference in that time was significant statistically, and also like passes the smell test of being like, okay, that seems like that's a big difference compared to anything else. But that's just what my initial thoughts were.
Yeah, so along the lines of that, to me, this is an observational data set. It's not like an RCT, or it's not being compared against anything else. It's not being essentially tested to see whether it's outperforming one another. They're just literally observing whether this thing happens. And they wanted to see if there are objective signs that, yeah, there was a difference between the holding and pushing isometrics, which interestingly, they didn't seem to find. They found that people fatigued subjectively, as we would expect in the holding and the pushing isometrics, but the results that they found didn't actually really support the fact that there are two different types of contraction. Is that what you guys kind of read from this as well?
Yeah,
I think they had trouble inferring it because of the pneumatic system. Because the way that it was set up, they're pushing against air pressure, and that would adjust based on the amount of force that they were applying. And because it adjusts, the amount of EMG you sort of have, yeah, I know, that's a great action, right? No one can see it if they're listening. But because it's adjusting to the pressure that you're applying, the EMG activity will be relative to that one. Like, I know it's meant to be an isometric, but if you're constantly adjusting how much pressure you're applying, this is the thing that I was thinking of. Because when you're just pushing against a static object, isometric. But when you have a force that you're trying to match, to me, it's sort of like eccentric concentric. Like, you're sort of like, there is isometric in there, but you're also sort of like,
you're moving.
I don't know, you're moving. So that was the main thing that in my head, I'm like, is it really an isometric test if you're constantly sort of oscillating between concentric and eccentric, or did they measure that?
They did. They measured the distance that people would like on average travel, and I think it was 3 centimeters. So that like pretended to be like a 1.2 degree difference in like the isometric. So it was probably what you'd see if you gave someone the exercise to do, which is what you want to see. Like, you want what you see in the clinic or in the research to mimic what you do in the clinic. So I think that was measured, that was kind of accounted for. But yeah, the thing was at the start, they were talking about how essentially, even though this is well known by coaches, there hasn't been, people have studied this before and they haven't been able to find like a reliable link to it. So they referenced of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They've referenced 5 or 6 papers in their background that said, they weren't able to distinguish a difference significantly in whether this phenomenon exists. So they set out to prove that this phenomenon exists. I don't know if that's how you do science. I think you don't go out to prove your hypothesis. You go out to disprove it. And I think there probably was a little bit of bias there in the fact that they didn't actually find what they were hypothesizing, but then they still went on to talk about how, like, yeah, this is how we would use these two things anyway.
Yes, yeah, that's right. I think the only thing that they found is that between giving someone a external task to be able to hold a consistent pressure against a semi-immovable object, that you're going to be able to kind of better regulate the amount of metabolic kind of well, it doesn't even have to, they couldn't prove it metabolic, but something made them fatigue less than when they just had a consistent pressure that was kind of pushing against them that was trying to overcome them. And they do go in and speculate that like with metabolic, or if it was to do with that was one of the main speculations, and the other was to do with like a preemptive. Just wait a second, I'll go into paper again. Someone else take up, and I'll just go.
I think I know what you're
thing.
talking about. They were talking about whether you had to like, it was just more difficult mentally or neuro complexity in like trying to match something. So like I was talking about this off air as well. Like if you tell me to push against a wall, I can be like, yep, I'm initiating this. I'm in control. I think that's an easier task than like an externally loaded thing where I'm resisting against it. I've got to kind of feel out where it is and then try and match it. That takes cognitive effort. It takes like a lot of feedback, like probably more feedback than what just pushing does. So maybe that's why it was more fatiguing as well. That they were
the thing I wanted to check for the two. That was the other thing that I wanted to check. Were the forces for the two matched?
Yep.
Yeah.
So they're exerting the exact same amount of force in the pushing versus holding, but one they fatigue more.
Yeah, they're trying to. Yeah.
Yes. So that's, as you said, kind of they call that, so probabilistically due to the anticipatory neuromuscular control mechanisms is why the hold isometric is more fatiguing, and then the other one was, or it's like the metabolic kind of byproducts are greater created in a hold isometric. But again, those two things weren't tested and would need to be tested to, I guess, actually validate either of those claims.
Yep.
Would you be able to give an example, Steve, for someone who's a bit of a layman in this space of a holding versus pushing isometric, let's say at the knee rather than the elbow?
Yep.
Like say for a squat, like an example of a pushing versus holding squat.
Yep. So if you just use your simple, I think for physios, the best way to think about it would be a holding type isometric would be if we're prescribing like how we would traditionally prescribe a wall squat or how we would traditionally prescribe a plank to someone, where they're just, the system is trying to create negative, like the external environment is trying to create negative work into the system. So trying to create an eccentric muscle action, and you're just using your like muscle force to hold against that. Whereas a push type would be any of your like crane scale dynamometry, push, any of the dynamometry kind of tests that you're doing, handheld dynamometer tests where someone is trying to press out against the isometric kind of force, something that's not going to move. So say you're doing your quads limb symmetry index testing at 90, 120 degrees.
Yep. I had
Cool.
I also had like a pin squat. So like if you've got a barbell on your back and you're pushing into pins, that was another example I had.
Isometric mid-thigh pull is a really good example of a push type.
Yep.
Isometric.
Or just like load up a deadlift with 300 kilos more than what you can do and give it a yank.
Yep.
That's going to tend towards a concentric action, but you're not going to go anywhere because you just don't have the capacity to lift something.
And that's the interesting thing in this that doesn't make, like, it's the proof of concept that doesn't, but it's not how we apply these things when we're using them, or when, so, they've had that at the same external force, that like the same amount of work was either trying to be created negatively into the system or being created by the person positively into the system. Whereas usually, you wouldn't be doing like a 50% or whatever. What was the
80%.
Was it, what was it?
80% of MVC.
Yeah, so that's not too bad. So usually you're looking, that would be like a minimum for a push. You're trying to go, as hard as you can or very close to as hard as you can for very short kind of periods of time. Whereas hold type isometrics, as we know, are more like you have your body weight that you're holding against, and it's just like, or you have a plate or something that you're holding in your hand, and you're just trying to hold that for as long as you possibly could. So more of an endurance type. kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So
is the push isometric something you would use more in like a power development kind of space there?
Yeah, usually. Yeah. So a 19-second push is a very long type of push, isometric.
Yeah. And like even our dynamometry testing, you get them to build up over a 5-second period, or you get them to check the rate of force development, you get them to do it within 1 second. That's still a isometric push, but it's like over a way less duration. So are the findings that a push duration can last longer than a holding duration, are they really like clinically relevant? Are we going to see that happen? Like, yeah. What do you reckon?
Well, in a clinic, it's just that I guess it's almost the opposite in the clinic. We just don't usually ever load someone externally that much where a hold isometric is going to like fold them earlier than they could have like been
So
pushing
like
with the same
500 kilos on their wall sit sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know
So,
what I mean?
But
It's
it's
that
still a
side of
holding,
it.
even though you whack 500 kilos to the point where they're going to yield. It's still a holding isometric.
that just becomes eccentric then.
It beca-
Yeah,
yeah, but this is what I'm sort of trying to get my head around is if you have someone doing a wall sit, which we're saying is a holding isometric, and then we load them up to the point where they're going to yield, does that become a pushing isometric then? Or is it still a holding isometric and they've just failed?
It just becomes an isotonic eccentric that they're lowering down.
Yeah. They failed their hold isometric, I guess, would be what you'd be saying in this circumstance. Yeah.
And that is way more fatiguing.
Yeah.
Like super maximal stuff.
Yeah. Like think like what is a Nordic hamstring curl, etc. I guess.
Yep.
That's like that is what a true that is more what this test is showing there. It's going like, yeah, if you have the same thing, if you put someone at the bottom and they tried to kind of curl up, or you had them at the top and you got like you could be at the bottom and try to pull yourself up for quite a decent amount of time, but there's no way you're there, and that same muscle length, you're like not
Falling.
actually ever going to be able to, well, unless you're a freak at Nordics, you're not going to be able to hold yourself before you fall, and it just becomes an eccentric.
Cool. So
sorry, we just went off probably basis.
No,
that's my bad. I wanted to clarify some of that because this is some of the stuff that I was having trouble teasing out when I was reading the paper. It took me about 5 minutes to get my head around it.
I think that's what we need to do here. Like, why is this clinically relevant? And yeah, I'm not sold on it. Like, I don't think they've proved their concept. Like, I don't think that they've actually found a distinguishable difference between holding and pushing isometrics, like from a physical sense or a physical standpoint, just other than, yeah, they fatigue really quickly, but we don't use that anyway. So like, I think that was an important question. I think it was an important discussion to have about it. The other thing I think would be, what do you think about how they went measuring it? Like, do you think that the protocol they used was like going to find the things that they were looking for, or was it going to dispel the other things that may happen, essentially? For people listening, they did 12 measurements. They did 2 with max intensity that were performed initially as push type isometrics to get a gauge of where their MVC was at. So that gave them like a baseline score to check where 80% would be, so they could do that. After this, each subject performed 10 more measurements. The first 6 measurements were made for 15 seconds at 80%. After that, they did 3 consecutive measurements of either holding or pushing, and that was randomized. So some people did the push first and some people did the holding type one first.
And they alternated, didn't they? They alternated between the 2.
So they did 3 and then 3. Then the 3 measurements of each task were done in the same order. The resting time was 60 seconds. Then the endurance measurements followed. So they did the 15-second strength-based one first, and then they did the one to failure after that, which was 120. So 2 minutes between endurance trials. So yeah, they did. Yeah. What do you think of that?
You first, Nat.
I'm just trying to get my head around the fact that they got people to do both, because I would have thought that if you're doing a good study, you would get X and A and B to do the push, one to do the hold, and then compare them. Are they? I don't know, like what the relevance of that is, but to me, it just doesn't seem you're going between the two. And I think an element of fatigue is something I was also a little bit concerned about. But 60 seconds doesn't seem like a great amount of time for rest when you're trying to determine whether or not, like the EMG reading.
Because like 15 seconds at 80% of something. What's 80% in terms of like 1 RM? That's what, like a 6 or 7 RM?
Yeah.
So if you're doing
you're holding it for 15 seconds, you're going to be cooked.
So 8.
You're going to be absolutely cooked.
So if you're doing,
so it's not going to give you a good result.
If you're doing a set of 8 squats going up and down, it is about 16 seconds for like a max, like an 8 RM.
Right.
Like if you're going 1
and then
second
60
up, 1
seconds
second
later,
down,
you're going to do it again.
which is cooked.
So, crazy.
I'd probably go, it'd be a little bit, you're looking at maybe, closer to double, about 30 seconds, I reckon. You'd be looking at for 8 RM. But yes, I definitely get your point there.
That time under tension type stuff.
Yeah.
The thing is, then they did the max fatigue trials afterwards, and they had like, it was pretty variable in terms of how long they could do it for. I'm pretty sure 2 people even pulled out because they were just knackered. Is that you guys read that?
That's pretty well. Pretty well.
Is this
regarding the analysis? 2 test persons had to be excluded because their measurements at push were stopped by rater prior to complete exhaustion due to prolonged trial duration. So they were just knackered from doing everything prior to their exhaustion. So they've only got a sample size of 10, and then they've had to exclude 2 of them. So now they've got a sample size of 8. Like, I think it was probably a super hard, and I don't know if it was super necessary. It was a super hard test protocol. And I don't know if like there were too many other confounding variables here. Like, they didn't mention training age. They mentioned that they're all uni students and they all did sports and exercise science, but they didn't tell us if any of them trained. They didn't tell us anything other than that. So I reckon the 2 people who pulled out might have just been like, this is cooked. Like, I've not experienced anything like this before. And then they're just like, nah, had it. And that's kind of, unfortunately, messed with some of the results.
Yes, like
I would have liked to have seen it done with force plates.
What was that, Nate?
I would have liked to have seen a similar study done with force plates.
They had
like you guys were talking about.
There was a force gauge part of it.
Yeah, I don't mind the pneumatic kind of setup that they had, that whole 90-degree. Like, I don't mind that because of the whole it being able to adjust to your variability and your push kind of thing.
I'm not sure.
So I didn't mind that.
Has that been validated before? I didn't bother checking that. Like, has that been something that's been used before in anything?
Not sure. I'm not sure, mate.
Pretty novel type of setup.
Like you look at the photo and you're just like, that's random as, but no, I'm sure they had their reasons or like ways to set that up with.
It makes sense. Like, looking at the picture, there's in figure 1, if you look at the picture, like, oh yeah, I can see that's what they're studying. So
yeah. And if you just go to sorry, no,
you're right. You go.
I was going to say, just going to like table 1 and going through the kind of differences in the trials. So you got like your mean of all the trials, the longest single trial, all that. I think that's very good kind of data to go down, and that is probably the biggest telling of the picture. Just their stats themselves, I think, are going to be kind of weak because of the power. So it's more kind of, for me, looking at those kind of the numbers themselves and seeing that, yes, there is that difference there, but they haven't really been able to show it and prove it with their paper. Like, they need someone to take this and run with it a bit more.
Because, for instance, like we were just saying before, if the people who did the hold isometrics who were going to be stronger at it or who were going to do it longer, were they just unluckily randomized to doing the push one first and being pre-fatigued? Like, this data, like only having 8 people, it could just be noise. Like there's not.
Yeah.
Was their shoulder supported?
No.
It wasn't, was it? Like, so
No.
they had to
No.
hold their shoulder in shoulder flexion while extending their elbow, like for repeated tests over like 15 minutes.
The strap might have like
So,
held
like,
it there a bit, but
like, try hold your arm in this position. Like, there's going to be fatigue through the shoulder as well while they're trying to do the test.
Was there any time where hold? There was no time, I don't think, where hold
outperformed.
was a higher than push, was there?
But it was definitely a lot closer in some, like 16 and 25, 10 versus 19, 19 versus 25. And then some people were like 88 versus 25.
Yeah.
So the standard deviation was about 8 seconds or whatever amongst the.
That's what I kind of took mostly from it, was like just looking at that and going, yeah, there's something there, but they can't say exactly what. You know what I mean? But there was definitely no time that the hold was better than the push.
Yep.
As in, they were able to hold it for longer than they could push.
Yep, for sure. So I think what we've found from this, we haven't really proved the concept that it's a different contraction, but we've proved the concept that maybe the type of like the intent behind it dictates how long you can go for. Because
this goes into like, were they trying to prove that it's a different type of muscle action, as in like there's concentric, eccentric, and then two, like, actually like isometric needs to be called two different, or is it just that like of isometric exercise, like when your muscle is acting isometrically, it can act to like resist external, like it can
one of two ways,
create positive work but not win, or resist negative work, in which case that's just like common, like, you know,
we know this
bro science
forever. It's just like known kind of biomechanics 101 forever, you know what I mean? It's not, I don't think that they're actually, I'm not sure what they were trying to do. If it's like we were trying to actually see, yes, there's actually a different, and well, actually, because they go in and they are EMGing and everything, that is probably what they are trying to do, to say that, hey, there is a different
difference between the two types of contraction.
You activate things completely differently when you're trying to push against something versus you activate when you're trying to hold against something. But that wasn't kind of shown.
So essentially they say here in the background, the literature regarding different forms of isometric muscle action is very poor. So they're looking for the two different types, but they haven't found that. That's literally the point of this paper, and they haven't been able to find that. They then go, after not really showing that in their results, to talk about it forever. Like they haven't, there was a big long discussion about it, and like it's, we haven't actually proved what you were looking for, or like, so how do we use it?
I think it's semantics here, though. I think it's semantics in that, like,
what's proof?
I don't know. It's almost going about the wrong way of being like everyone knows you can either push against something or you can hold against, and like they are two different stimuli. Like they're not the exact, even though they're both a isometric muscle contraction, they are two vastly different stimuli.
The direction of torque is different.
Yeah. Exactly.
So is it like, and is it just this semantics thing? Like they didn't really go out and prove what they wanted to, or show that these two things existed, because we kind of know they do, but like, how do we do it? So I think this just wasn't the way to do it.
Yes.
And if it is the way to do it, you need a buttload more people and maybe not such a fatiguing protocol.
Yeah. I would be happy on, I think it just needs to be like repeated with then one of those, like more people. And just wait a second, bringing up the thing again, like talking into, okay, now that they know that, yes, they find a difference in fatigue, test that first and only that, and power for that, to be like, okay, can we actually statistically say there is a huge difference in fatigue here for the same level? Then I would like it kind of tested to how it's actually kind of more how coaches and probably good physios have been using it for a long time, of being like, okay, now we're going to do things where let's just test what, say, EMG activity in like a long prolonged, like a wall sit to fatigue, and what that looks like and what the lactate kind of is, and power that well, and then be like, now we're going to just have a look at what EMG activity and whatever is for, like, just throwing on the heaviest weight that someone can like hold for a second, and do the same for like someone pushing against something with all their might versus pushing against something for the same amount of time that they could have held a wall sit for. And again, lactate versus like EMG, or and see if those things, like, that's gonna, I think it just has to be done in a few more steps, and also done at those extremes that it's actually trained in, kind of thing, or used in, because a push isometric, as I said, you're not usually there pushing against something for kind of 19, 20 seconds, whatever. It's like a few 5 seconds, if you can, for 5 seconds as hard as you possibly can, and then kind of ease back off, and then you're going to go again, you know what I mean? And you're usually using it to make sure that you can train in a position where someone isn't painful, so they can still get a training stimulus, or as a way to be less fatiguing. So it doesn't, unfortunately, get any of the ways that we would use it, or it doesn't also prove the concept. So it's kind of just sitting in the middle.
So I think you're right there. It doesn't prove concept. It ticks off one of the ways we sometimes use it, like in the context of like your pain isometric type thing, where you actually do want to hold it isometric for what Ebony Rio's paper was 4 or 5 sets of 45 seconds. Yeah, that's not probably an 80% MVC.
70% in her paper, I think.
Yeah, okay, cool. So it's probably pretty close, but they do it for ages. And that's how we, like, in physio land traditionally would use it since
Which is
come
a hold
out.
isometric.
Correct. Yeah.
Not a push.
But then in an Achilles tendinopathy, same thing, it's a hold, but you can do a push just off the floor. So do we think that this changes anything we're going to do?
No. And no. I have had to review all those papers that you just cited there as well. It's just funny. The whole like physio love of isometrics is for pain relief for tendons is like completely unfounded.
Correct.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. That one study they brought out with Ebony Rio was like, whoa, this is like the magic bullet for knee pain. And then it's just like,
we should go into it one stage, but it was six patients, and
yes.
It is very variable. And then it's
something we could talk about on another podcast.
100%.
I'd love to. I'd love to talk about.
Exactly.
So I don't think that this is like implicating any differences on that. I don't think that this finding about the endurance being like going out quicker on a holding versus a pushing changes what we do in that regards. And I can't think of any other practical implications in whereby I would change what I'm currently doing.
Do you guys think there is a different type of muscle, or do you guys think it's hard? Like, is there a different type of muscle action? Probably no, but is there a difference in between a pushing isometric and a holding isometric?
Like, if you think about like how actin and myosin like pull on one another, like there's only one way they can kind of do it, and either they're overcoming the thing and getting closer together, those Z lines, whatever, getting closer together. They're either holding the same stagnant position or they're lengthening under whatever force. And like, I either think if it's overcoming and becoming like a concentric, you're just doing an isometric tending towards a concentric, and then same with the other way, tending towards an eccentric. I can't see how those little fibers and things would do something different. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah. Nate, what do you reckon?
I'm the same as Parky. My one takeaway for me is still just getting my head around the fact that you can be more fatigued from one versus the other, even if theoretically the force that you're producing is the same.
The thing I think for me from so pragmatically, so Parky, I agree 100%. Like, yeah, your little actin-myosin are only going to feel that they are kind of holding in one place against, like, there's tension, but they are holding in one place, and that's what is happening. But I think it's going to be the oh, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. That's so annoying.
Actin and
The monkey and his symbols are back.
Oh, sorry. I'll get back. I'll find where I was at again.
Okay.
I had like this full train
His
of thought
brain
and
just
I've lost it.
So I think we've probably talked the crap out of that. The only other thing I wanted to mention in this paper is about how condescending it was.
Yes, that's funny.
It was just like, this is the first line of it. The human organism basically has 2 operation modes. It's like, okay, like maybe people don't know them. Like, it's not that basic. Like, there's more than that. And then there was other times throughout when they were like, obviously it's common knowledge or whatever. I'm like, how I don't understand these tables and stuff. I've had to read them 3 times. This paper just made me feel dumb.
That's what I was gonna say now.
It's back.
It's back. It's back. Lads, back. For practical standpoint. Like, yes, they're feeling the same thing, but if you are trying to do something like put the same amount of force that you could put trying to put positive work into the system with an isometric contraction, with a hold isometric, so with a like an external load trying to put negative work into the system, it just like you can't actually reach that, because where is the line between 100% MVC of a
Isometric.
of a hold isometric and an eccentric muscle, like those 2 points? It's like 100% and then like 101. Like, you can't actually, like, then it's like, is it 101 straight away? It's eccentric, whereas like concentric is only, so then that's a Nordic, right? That's what you're attempting with the Nordic. That's what your hamstrings are attempting to do when you're sprinting and then like trying to decelerate your leg as it goes through. They're just failing an isometric, basically. So whereas a push type, you can train at 100% of your MVC, because no matter what happens, like, yeah, failing that thing doesn't, well, it can lead to a concentric muscle action, but then that's, you've still reached, you're at 100% and you're able to train at 100%, whereas you can't really train at 100% of a holding isometric, because like it just becomes an eccentric.
Yeah, you're gonna fail.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think
there's a split time somewhere where it's like, if you can hold it for a 0.01 of a second, is that you know what I mean? So whereas you can kind of push against something at 100% MVC for a trainable decent amount of time. So they are 2 different things to be able to train. You know what I mean? Even though it's the exact same muscle action, they are 2 different stimuli that you are actually able to train. So you can train really strength, super maximal, like really hard strength work with your pushing, whereas you're holding, you can do super maximal, but that's now an eccentric. You know what I mean? So
correct. But again, it still doesn't change what the muscle's doing. And I
doesn't change what the muscle's doing at all.
I don't think we're going to be able to solve this unless it becomes like a quantum mechanics type situation where like the thing you're observing now is gone. Like,
the other cool way though to make use of the fact that you can make use of the fact that you can only hold it for like a split like whatever of a second, and that second that it existed was an actual useful second, is like say I'll use a hold isometric in in post ankle sprains, they're really, really hard to get back that last couple of degrees of plantar flexion laid on, and people feeling like, hey, I can get springy and up and going again. And so what you can get someone to do is get themselves artificially prop themselves up into, because you can passively get them into that plantar flexion, but they can't get themselves into that plantar flexion alone. You get them up there and you put them under there, because they can calf raise to like, say, 4 or 5 degrees away from that. So they have the strength, but they don't have the strength to get to that
position.
last end range. You can get them into that last end range and get them to hold there for like the tiniest bit of a second until they fail and it goes there. So you can use it as like that, hold like a super maximal, but then it becomes an eccentric.
Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. But it is a useful way to
expose that tissue to that demand, and then have it probably transfer over.
Yeah.
Cool.
That was kind of the point I was trying to make before with whacking on plates onto someone doing a wall sit until they reach failure.
Dipping. Yeah, okay. Well, do we have any other thoughts about this one?
Cool concept, crappy paper.
Yeah.
Cool concept, crappy paper. They need to outline what they're trying to, if they actually think there is, as you said, physiologically a different muscle, which I don't think. I think they are going into that there's EMG differences. Your brain perceives them as two complete different challenges and gives EMG activity accordingly. And that's the direction that they need to go further down.
I don't know if that was, I think they were actually trying to prove or looking for the fact that there is a different thing, like a difference between the two, because they've like written here on like literally the background, one can resist an object or push against it, although both cases no motion is carried out. The literature regarding different forms of isometric muscle action is very poor. While isometric muscle action includes no gross joint motion, nevertheless, energy is consumed executing it. During performance of isometric muscle action in pilot studies, we have observed that 2 types of isometric muscle action can be executed. But I don't think that they have ever done that, and I don't know if they will, and I don't think
they can't make that conclusion based on that. That's ridiculous.
No. And they're pretty much...
I actually don't know how it got published.
Well, no, negative findings should be getting published, but there's a lot of errors.
But with those findings, you know what I mean? And that statement at the end.
That's
like,
not
how
what
can
this
you
says.
Make that conclusion?
Correct. That's not what this says.
How have you made that conclusion from your results? That doesn't make any sense.
So hopefully that summarizes that paper for people, because it is a tough one to read. It was, I had to read it a couple of times, and there was like a lot of definitions and acronyms and tables and things flying around. So hopefully we've done it a little bit of justice, or we've done it. You've got the main concepts out of it now. Just listeners out there, hopefully it made sense, and the monkey didn't bash the cymbals too many times.
And even better, Steve's got out of putting me to bed.
That's right.
Well, hopefully Sarah doesn't listen to this one. So no final thoughts on that one, boys?
No, I'm happy.
That's Excellent. Good. I'll still use the 2 different types of isometric, but knowing that it's the same muscle action.
Correct. The 2 types of intent or torque direction, if we call it that.
2 types of intent.
Yeah. So thank you guys for listening, grinding out a proper RPE10 podcast with us. You can find us in all our links below. We'll link the paper. We'll link a few of the other papers we mentioned as well. But yeah, if you guys want to give us some feedback, hit us up on Instagram, hit us up on YouTube channel, hit us up on email. We do have an email as well. We'll put all the links in that below, or you can find us on any of our personal Instagram, personal Twitter, things like that. And that will all be linked below. So that was another episode of the RPE podcast, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Cool.